right, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning for managing substance use disorder and partner abuse intervention programs. We're really excited to have this conversation today with you all in this discussion. This is a 2-hour training session. This session is also being recorded and it's also being shared live on Facebook, just in case somebody in our community might come across this training and it may be beneficial to them, so that way they can share as well within their own communities. If you have any questions in the meantime within this presentation on Facebook, go ahead and place your questions in the comment box and we will make sure to address those questions. And as for the questions in the Zoom meeting, we will have a session halfway through where Larry is going to go ahead and make some room or have time to address those questions. So please go ahead and put them in the chat. My colleague Shauna is going to be keeping an eye out on that if there are any questions. So just an FYI, we will be addressing questions halfway through, and then at the end of the session as well, if there are any other lingering questions, we will also address them then. This session, as mentioned, for those of you just joining now, as we see, this is going to be a big training, which is fantastic. We're up to like 220 people. Thank you so much for joining us. This session is going to be recorded. So just in case if something happens or you need to step out or whatever it may be, this session will be recorded. You all will get the link from it. Our communications director, Rochelle, will be making it pretty. And so it'll be accessible for you all on our YouTube channel. Had to put the plug in there. Please follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We also have a newsletter where you can obtain the most up-to-date training information that we have here at the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence. My name is Teresa Garcia. I'm the Director of Training here at the Coalition. If you all have any questions, please let us know. With that being said, I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, David Garvin, who connected with Larry and created this amazing topic for us today. And so with that being said, I'm going to hand it over to you now, David.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all here. We're getting close to our halfway point.
This is Cindy again. Can you hear me? Good morning.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just keep going. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague of many years, Larry Bennett, Dr. Larry Bennett. Larry is the guy when it comes to talking about the issue of domestic violence and drug and alcohol use. Larry is the top of the mountain, and we are so happy to have him here. I'm just looking around at the chat. It's great that you guys are putting in where you're from. I just caught a glimpse of, somebody on the East Coast, somebody on the West Coast, and everybody in between. Larry, we've got a full house today, and we're looking forward to it. So without taking any more time, we're just going to go ahead and turn it right over to you. Thank you, my friend.
I've got a bunch of stuff, a technical question. I got a bunch of stuff at the bottom of my screen here. Is that going to go away, like screen sharing and all of that?
No, you should be good to go.
But I mean, it's blocking my my slides.
You can
just drag it away.
Oh, drag it away. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Perfect.
That's the one. That just won't go away. Anything I can make that go away?
And is it your chat or the participants or what?
It says mute, stop video, participants chat. Along the bottom, it's a bar. It seems to be taking up my screen.
Gotcha. There should be 3 little dots at the top.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And then that should be able to, you should have
leave.
Don't leave.
No, don't leave.
Okay. So which of these many things should I check? I apologize, folks, for my ignorance on Zoom, but this is what you get.
I think you should be able to disappear it. It should give you an option of disappearing that bar.
Okay.
Or if you click on your PowerPoint.
Okay, I've hidden the video panel. So
there's an arrow on the chat symbol.
I got it.
Cool.
Thank you.
All done. All
Takes
right.
a village.
Gotta love Zoom.
Yeah. Any over 10 minutes to do this, I should be ready to go here. Let's see, hide floating meeting controls. There we go. Okay. Okay, hi everybody. Happy to be here. And thanks to the New Mexico Coalition and all of the people involved. I, as some of you might know, I've been retired for a few years, so I'm a bit out of the loop. I got a kick out of being the top of the mountain. The advantage of being the top of the mountain in any given field is that you get to get up high enough that you can see where the big mountains really begin. And that's kind of where I'm at. There's so many people doing work in this particular area now. Some of them might be on this event, but I am happy to be asked to be here because this is an important issue for me. And so now I don't know how to advance my slide. There it goes. Okay. All right. Anyway, most of you understand that there are lots that substance abuse by the perpetrator of domestic violence is our main topic today and what to do about that. But there are three things that sort of historically, no matter which research studies you look at, and I'm somebody that tends to look at research studies, no matter which studies you look at, there are lots and lots and lots of different things that have been linked to causally to domestic violence. But the three that come up time and time again over and over in almost every study that's been done, in addition to substance abuse by the perpetrator, is a history of violence in the family of origin and social class or income. I don't want to lose track of that stuff. We're going to keep coming back to this time and time again. Okay, I'm still having trouble changing my things. This is a study that I want to just point out as we start this. This was probably about 10 years old, maybe even older than that. But this looks at the question of, is there a relationship between the kind of substance that people use and domestic violence? And this was a very large study that was done with adults, not clinical, but this was a sample of the US population. And as you can see in the first column are the drugs that we're interested in and wondering whether or not there's a relationship between that particular drug and domestic violence. In the second column where it says number of users per 1,000, these are the number of people who, out of every 1,000 people in this sample who use this particular substance, like 70.7% of people use alcohol, 8.6% report using marijuana. And I might add, since this is at least 10 years old, that marijuana number is going to be substantially larger than 86 per 1,000 now. But I don't think the other numbers in the other two columns are going to change at all. We've just changed our perspective on marijuana, and we haven't changed our perspective on the other drugs in that column. But in the third column is the domestic violence rate if the person has experienced domestic violence, if they've used that particular drug in the past 12 months. And in the last column is the percentage of people in this particular sample who have experienced domestic violence if they've not used that particular drug. So just looking at alcohol, 707 or 70.7% of Americans in this sample use alcohol. If they have used alcohol in the past 12 months, 6.7% have experienced domestic violence victimization on this sample, and 4.8% have not. And with marijuana, 88.6% have used marijuana at this time in history. And 16%, if they had used marijuana, 16% had experienced domestic violence in the past year, and 5.2% have not. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time going over this, but there's some hidden points in here that I want to point out to you. One is I organize these in terms of number of users per 1,000. So more people use alcohol than marijuana, more people use marijuana than pain relievers and so forth. But as we go down, we see that as we go down and we get fewer and fewer people who are using that particular substance, we look over in the column at the domestic violence rate, it goes up substantially. And if we look over at the domestic violence rate, it really doesn't move much at all. So one of the things you might be tempted to take away from this is that people who use crack cocaine in the past 12 months, all 5 out of 1,000 that have done that, over a third of them have experienced domestic violence. And if they didn't use crack cocaine, again, a small, roughly the same percent have not experienced it. You might be tempted to say that there's something in crack cocaine or something in heroin or something in methamphetamine that causes people to be violent. That would be one of the takeaway points from this. I just want to advise you to let go of that once and for all, that that is just not how it works. And I'm going to spend pretty much the rest of the time talking about why this particular chart is somewhat deceptive. And it's an important thing to talk about simply because a lot of us tend to believe that these so-called really bad drugs like PCP and so forth are things that have sort of violence built into them in some cases. And I'm going to spend the first part of today kind of talking about what we know about the link between substance use and domestic violence, and keep coming back to this point about whether there are certain kinds of drugs. One of the things you need to know right off the bat is that alcohol is the drug that accounts for the vast majority of domestic violence. If you did the math on this, you could figure that out. So I don't think there's any question at all at this point that there's some kind of link between substance abuse and domestic violence. And we're going to spend an hour talking about what that might be. What's the data that suggests that? Well, if we go to domestic violence programs, partner abuse intervention programs, at least half and usually more than half have substance abuse issues at the time that they're in the program, and they're 8 times more likely to batter on a day in which they've been drinking. If we go to substance abuse treatment programs, again, looking at men or people who identify as men in substance abuse treatment programs, if they've battered in the past year and are 11 times as likely to batter on the day in which they've been drinking. So about the same number. Whether you look at men in batters programs or you look at men in substance abuse treatment programs, you're going to see about half and probably more than half of those people have the other problem, the co-occurring problem that we're talking about today. When we shift now to looking at women receiving services at victim service agencies, half of those people have some kind of SUD issue, substance abuse issue. And if you really want to get a high number, go and talk to women who are getting treatment for substance abuse issues. And between 67 and 80% of those women at the time that they are in substance abuse treatment are actively domestic violence victims. I don't know about you, but this really concerns me that so very many people have the co-occurring issue. That we have a lot of co-occurring issues in our life, but the problem is more concerning when you realize that very little is done to really pay attention to this issue. Now, I'm sure that there are lots of folks on this call who work their tails off paying attention to this issue. So I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the people out there in America and Canada and other places who do this work who are not paying attention to this issue. And that concerns me a great deal. Okay, so we know that there's a link. We've got data that suggests that they're linked, but here's the problem. Most men who drink and drug are not drinking or drugging when they batter. Most people who are heavy drinkers, and the feds call that 5 drinks per drinking day or more. I'll let you do your personal math here for a moment. But most of those heavy drinkers don't batter ever. And it turns out that the apparent correlation, and I'm sure that somewhere when you went to school, somebody said that don't get correlation confused with cause, and that's especially true here. But the apparent correlation between substance abuse and domestic violence really only fits a subgroup of people. And I'd really like you to walk away from here today thinking that you have a little bit of a better understanding about how to identify that subgroup. And that's what we'll talk about, particularly in the second half. And regardless, now keep in mind, we all are used to hearing how substance use disorder is what causes domestic violence, or it's one of the causes of domestic violence. Make no mistake about it, domestic violence also causes substance use disorder. And I don't think we get enough attention there. But the bottom line is that the presence of either one of those issues always makes the other problem worse. So you can't just ignore it. It's not something that's really going to go away. So how do we explain this relationship? Most of you have heard the term disinhibition, and so you probably think that alcohol or drugs disinhibit you. It's a kind of an old-fashioned term that really meant that back when we used to think in terms of naked apes and stuff like that, that humans have this inbred sort of tendency to be violent to one another, that there was something about alcohol or drugs that sort of got into the brain and unhooked that sort of naked ape feature, and outcome this violence. And that's not what we're talking about when we mean disinhibition now, because first of all, there's nothing in the brain that inhibits violence. There's no part of the brain whose job is to do that. And so it can't be unhooked. And so when we talk about disinhibition now, we talk about cognitive disinhibition. And right now, the best model that we have about the relationship between substance abuse and domestic violence is called alternately cognitive disinhibition, or the perfect storm model is kind of what I like to call it, or the I-cubed model, referring to the three words that begin with I in the left-hand column: impelling and instigating and inhibiting. I, for one, have never used the word impelling knowingly, so it really means predisposition. What it is inside of us that sort of predisposes us to this kind of behavior. And we know that there are certain characteristics, psychological characteristics: high levels of hostility, high levels of negative affect, high levels of obsessiveness, low levels of guilt, high levels of risk-taking. All this sort of boils down to the Homer Simpson phenomenon: stove side, ouch, stove side, ouch, stove side, ouch. That is a predisposition for risk-taking, and that kind of thing is one of the things that we see in people who tend to link domestic violence and substance abuse in their life. High levels of impulsivity, and my personal favorite, the old 1950s, which I can't stop using, stake and conformity. Someone who has a high stake in conformity cares what other people think about them. It would bother them if people thought that they were violent to their partner. They wouldn't want their boss knowing that. They really care about having things like jobs and a place in society. And then there are other people who don't. And for those people who have a low stake in conformity, that is, they really don't care what other people think about them or what happens, those people are far more likely to be predisposed to domestic violence. Anyway, I'm not trying to make domestic violence sound like a purely psychological phenomena, and it's not. But we'll get to that in a second. The second factor in the I-cubed or perfect storm model is instigation. And don't get too concerned about this, because I know a lot of you are on guard against the idea that victims of domestic violence cause their own violence, or there's something in the relationship that causes violence and so forth. But nevertheless, this relationship conflict is an instigating factor. But the important thing is the relationship conflict does not have to be real. It can be entirely imagined. If I've been drinking some Miller Genuine Draft and my wife doesn't come home when she's supposed to, I'm sitting there thinking, I wonder where my wife is. She's usually here. At about a 6-pack, I'm thinking, I'll bet she's out fiddling around with some man. And at a couple 6-packs, I'm going to be ready for her when she walks in the door. So this is the kind of thing that this is all in my mind, this level of relationship conflict, and substance use does increase the possibility of that happening. And the third thing is inhibition. disinhibition, that there's something in alcohol that changes our ability to attend to things, to see things the way they actually are, our own self-awareness, our ability to perceive what's going on around us. So these three things together in the perfect storm model are what links substance abuse and domestic violence. Now, like a lot of epidemics, I turn to, somebody's making a lot of noise out there. Maybe you could mute yourself. But anyway, I often turn to Gary Larson and his Far Side cartoons to explain stuff that I can only barely grasp myself. Here we have a cartoon, and here we have a white dog and a black dog apparently instigating Sam, who is a black dog, to perhaps go over to that fence and jump over that fence and not.
You're muted. I can't
Larry,
hear
you're
you.
muted.
Yeah, I can't hear you. Still can't hear you.
There you go. I'm sorry. You people are just going to have to deal with my amateurish understanding of this stuff. So that's, I apologize again. But in any case, here we have an example of what we're calling this I-cubed model. Sam is being instigated by these other dogs in this case, and it's not unusual that instigation doesn't always come from within, it can come from without as well, and in this case it is. We don't know what Sam is thinking or what his predisposition is, so I just drew a little pink cloud there to sort of say that something's going on in his head that might increase or decrease his risk for going over that fence, which he certainly looks like he's going to do. Down at the bottom, we see evidence of disinhibition. The bottle's laying on the ground. And we know that he is sufficiently disinhibited because he's not paying attention to the sign that says, don't go in here. And he's not paying attention to how big that cat is. He may be like my cats who look out in the yard. We live in the country. We have turkeys, see those little bitty things out there. And you could just see the cat saying to themselves, I think I could take him because he's just a little guy. He's clearly been disinhibited to the extent where he's not perceiving what's going on around him. And that's what we mean by this perfect storm model. We have predispositions to things in our life. Some of us do. All of us have predispositions. Some of us have predispositions which get us into trouble sometimes. We all have things going on in our life which could instigate us. Sometimes we can just make those things up, and sometimes they're really out there in the world. And we all have signs and signals coming from other places that saying you need to do this, you need to pay attention to that. And if we're sufficiently disinhibited, we're not going to pay attention to it. And that's where we get into problems. So if we bought this perfect storm lens, and I've got a couple other models I'm going to go through here too in a second, but I just want to emphasize that I really think this is kind of the best understanding that we currently have. What could we take from this? Well, we could take from it that there appears to be that substance use actually does increase the risk for domestic violence. There's more to it than that, but the substance is a necessary part of the equation. Well, let me back up and restate that. You don't have to, obviously don't have to have substances to be domestically violent, but if you do use substance, you increase your risk for domestic violence. That's what I meant. The second thing is that there are a number of things that this model would say that we could do to reduce the risk for domestic violence and the link between substance abuse and domestic violence. One thing is we could decrease the amount of substance used or entirely. I think that's kind of what most of us think is probably the best thing to do, but there's lots of other things that we can do other than that. One is we can strengthen inhibitions, and I have a feeling that that's what a lot of you spend a lot of time doing in your job, working with people's working with people's ability to say no to coercion and aggression, and finding alternatives to dealing with that kind of situation. We could also reduce instigation. Now, there's always a tendency to sort of drag in the romantic partner at that point, because the assumption is that the instigation has to come from somewhere else. That's not really true. There are lots of things in our lives that instigate us, and a lot of you probably spend a lot of time talking with people about things that are going on in their life that are really stirring the pot. And finally, refining predispositions, the way we think about things is something that you also probably spend a lot of time doing. All of these things that you do are supported by this model, and decreasing substance is only one of them, and it may not be the most important one. But the thing I want to move on to something else now, and I want to say that the effects of drug and alcohol on coercion and aggression and domestic violence are really not only due to intoxication. And so getting people unintoxicated is not going to fix the domestic violence. I'm sure many of you know that. There are other ways of thinking about this. One of them is called a timeout model. This is a sociological, sort of an anthropological model. The idea is that cultures all have historically used alcohol and drugs as a timeout from responsibility. I may be wandering through the A&P parking lot after drinking heavily and decide that I really, really can't make it to the bathroom, and so I'm just going to take a whiz right there in the A&P parking lot. And when that happens and the police haul me in, I'm basically going to say, that's not me, Judge. I'm just not the kind of guy that's going to take a whiz in the A&P parking lot. It really was the alcohol that did that to me. And what I'm saying is, one, it was the alcohol that caused my bladder to go wacky on me. But I'm also saying it's the alcohol that allowed me to do something that I wouldn't normally do. And this historically has been something that we say to judges and therapists and police officers and romantic partners and other people. We want them to understand that that's not me. And different cultures have different stories about this, but all cultures in the world in which alcohol is used, and there's a great book called Family Violence and Cross-Cultural Perspective that actually looked at 90 different cultures, that looked in domestic violence in those cultures and looked at what caused or what prevented violence. And what they found, interesting, I won't spend any time on this, but they found that there are actually 15% of the many cultures, these are small cultures in the world, who don't have domestic violence. And I think a lot of us have a hard time understanding that. We sort of think that this is probably a universal phenomenon. It's not. There really are cultures that can do that. And what they found in this particular study, just to sort of take it a little farther, is that the thing that those cultures which have unambiguous and unambivalent sanctions against violence, against children, against seniors, against partners, and so forth. In those cultures, there is no domestic violence. And I don't know, Phyllis Frank has been haranguing us about this for the longest time, and it just turns out to be true. It's something that we don't pay enough attention to, and we pay more attention to working with individuals and less attention to working with cultures and changing cultures. But if we were to look at the timeout model, the culturally based excuse of timeout, that would help us if we were to go in that direction. Another lens that we can look at, in addition to sort of culture and in addition to the sort of IQ model, another lens that we can look at is that of expectations. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know about you, but I know for a fact that when I use alcohol, I'm a better dancer. And all of your chuckling and smirking is not going to change any more than my wife telling me that that's not true, as she has done many times. But here's the deal. This is my lived experience. I know this to be true. You can't change somebody's experience when they know something to be true. If I got to get down and do something like the twist, yeah, I'm not going to do that unless I have something to drink. I just admit it. And when I do drink, I'm damn good at it. This I know. A lot of people know a lot of things about alcohol and the relationship of alcohol and their behavior. I interviewed one time back in the day, I interviewed 63 men who were in inpatient treatment for alcohol and drug recovery and use, and their female partners. And the story I heard over and over and over again was some variation of the following. And this would come first from the partner and then be confirmed by the person who is in treatment. You know, when he's drinking Miller Genuine Draft, he's just fine. Or if he's not drinking, he's a wonderful man. But when he has a beer or two, he's just fine. But when he starts drinking Jack Daniels, all hell breaks loose. Well, Miller Genuine Draft and Jack Daniels are the same drug. And what's more, if I'm a smart guy, and if my goal is to get her to do what I want to do, and she's not doing it when I'm drinking Miller Genuine Draft, I'm going to reach for the Jack, and that's going to get what I need done. We'll talk more about this in a second. This notion that we have expectations and that we follow these expectations, and it's the expectation of what the alcohol is going to do that really determines what we're going to do rather than something else like the alcohol. They've done some I call them balanced placebo experiments. They're basically randomly assign people to certain conditions and then extract those conditions. And in this particular experiment, they would randomly assign people to either get alcohol or orange juice. And then of those people that they gave the alcohol to, they would randomly assign as to what they were going to tell them that they were giving them. Now, we can't do this kind of stuff anymore. I hope you understand that. This was back in the day. But anyway, half of those people, here's some alcohol, pretty good stuff. Don't drink too much of it though. And the other half of the people who get alcohol are going to say, here's some orange juice. It tastes kind of funny. It's from Florida. And the other half, the people who are not getting the alcohol, half of them, they're going to say, here's some alcohol. I covered up the taste, but it's alcohol. And the other half, here's some orange juice. So you got half the people getting alcohol, half the people getting orange juice. Half the people know what they got and half the people don't. And so then I'm going to call in my local experimental psychologist who's going to poke you with a sharp stick. And these folks know how to poke. So that you go from 0 to pissed off just about like that. So if alcohol was what caused people to be aggressive, or we have some measure of aggression, I mentioned that, obviously, some kind of measure of aggression. It's not domestic violence because that would be unethical, but it's some other measure of aggression that stands in for domestic violence. So if alcohol caused people to be domestically violent or aggressive, in this case, those who got the alcohol would be more aggressive, and those who didn't get the alcohol would be less aggressive. That's not what happens. What happens is the people who think they got the alcohol are aggressive, and the people who think they didn't get the alcohol, regardless of whether they did or they didn't, are not, or are less. Now, this doesn't always work this way. I would say that if we do 100 of these experiments, probably 70 of them will work out this way and the others won't for whatever reason. But it's enough to say that there's something going on about belief or expectation when it comes to substance abuse and domestic violence. And the belief that when I'm drinking, it's a good chance that I'm going to be violent is actually more of a cause of violence than the drinking. Now, there is some evidence that this is male specific as well. This is not strong evidence, but there is some evidence that this happens, happen more with men. So I've gone through a couple of models, a couple of different lenses. I like to think of them as lenses. I mean, kind of like go to the optometrist and they say, is it better this way or is it better this way? Better this way, better that way. I think that's kind of what we have to do, because not everybody is the same. All of us have lots of different things that cause us to do what we do. And certainly in the case of the people using alcohol and drugs and those people becoming or not becoming domestically violent or using coercion in the process, those people have lots of different things that are going on with them. And so we need different lenses to look at as we get at the story, if we're going to figure out what the right intervention is, unless you're one of those people who think everybody gets the same intervention, and I hope you're not. Unless you think everybody needs the same intervention, then we want to know what is the relationship for substance abuse and domestic violence in this particular person, and then use that information to match. And we'll spend the time, the second half today, talking about tools and things like that that you can use. But there are questions that we can ask people. I mean, you don't ask these questions, but these are the questions that you have in your mind. When did the perpetrator and the victim, if the victim used drugs, relative to the domestic violence? When did that happen? Was it yesterday? Was it 10 minutes ago, et cetera? That makes a difference. What are the personality characteristics and living conditions and need for power? We didn't talk about that, but I'm sure you understand that. And how does that influence the relationship between drugs and domestic violence in this particular person? What's the family and the social history of violence and trauma and substance abuse of both the victim and the perpetrator? Again, we have to be very careful. There's no evidence that the victim's use of alcohol and drug causes domestic violence. And it's very tempting. We did I probably get in trouble for saying this, but we did back when I was at the Addictions Technology Transfer Center, we did a study of the 5 states in the central part of the country and asked questions about I'm not going to say it. I'm just not going to say it. That's going to stir up a hornet's nest. I don't want to go there. Never mind. If I get guts, I'll say it in a minute. But anyway, looking at the family history of violence, get rid of this. Pardon me just a second. Okay. Move this thing here. So family history of trauma and substance abuse, the victim and the perpetrator. And I will say it has to do with codependence. As it turns out that 60% of the people in our sample, this was many, many hundreds of people across 5 states, wasn't a random sample, but it was a pretty good sample of people in the addictions field. That was the people we're looking at here. 60% of those people, almost 70%, believe that domestic violence is evidence of codependency on the part of the victim of domestic violence. That's a deeply disturbing idea. The fact that, pardon my coughing, I'm just getting over COVID. Anyway, I lost myself due to my cough, but anyway, looking at the family, the codependency. I seem to be wanting to avoid saying this, but anyway, if addictions people believe that battered women are codependent just by virtue of the fact that they are battered, that they're victims of domestic violence, you can imagine what treating that person must involve. And so this is something that maybe I'm not going to say anything else about, but there are beliefs that are held not only in the addictions field, but in the domestic violence field, that are kind of, you know, codependency is another word for the socially traditional roles of women. And it's applied to something that's seen as very clinical. So it's a dangerous idea. It's something that we have to talk about if we want addictions people to do domestic violence work. And a lot of addictions agencies do domestic violence work. And then the other thing we might want to talk to people about is to what do they attribute their domestic violence and substance abuse? They're probably going to attribute it to the drug itself, which, as I've said, is probably not a very good thing to do. But anyway, we're using these different lenses to help us ask questions of people so that we can come to an idea about how to best serve that particular person, given their culture, given their experiences and so forth. I'm hearing voices. Somebody's talking in the background. Could you quit talking?
I'll try and go through and mute people.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you could please mute, even if you're on the phone, thank you.
Okay. Robin Room, the Canadian researcher, said something once that has never left me. He said, alcohol is an instrument of intimate domination. And I bet you dimes to donuts that a lot of you have had a direct experience of that very thing. Let me tell you how I usually experience that. Sometimes I'm at a party, and it doesn't matter whether I'm drinking or not drinking, but somebody has been drinking a lot. And that person walks up to me and in a really, really loud voice starts talking to me and gets about 6 inches away from my face so they can be sure and hear everything that they have to say. So that's a drunk person. What do I do in that situation? I'll tell you exactly what I do. I take about 2 or 3 steps backwards. And why is that? Because you just don't know what someone who's that drunk is going to do. People adjust their behavior to deal with drunkenness. And that hence Robin Room's phrase, alcohol is an instrument of intimate domination. That's one of the things that he meant by that. Drunkenness serves to control partner behavior by increasing unpredictability and fear. This has been studied a number of times. The CDC study that Ed Gondorf did, batters programs, 800 and some people across the country in 4 different places, found that the drunkenness was the single best predictor of reoffense after the batters program. The single best. And not incidentally some fancy smancy things like the addiction severity index or something like that. But the simple question, have you been drunk since the last time I talked to you, was the best predictor of recidivism in the program. A big Canadian study of not people in batters programs, but just in the general population, found that the frequency that the person drank quadrupled the likelihood of victim fear, even when they controlled for all the things that might explain victim fear, like how much alcohol is used, social class, race, marital status, all that kind of stuff. It's the fear, the frequency of drunkenness that is most associated with victim fear. So I don't think people really understand how controlling drunkenness is. And flip it over, I don't think people understand how people who use coercion employ drunkenness as a coercive technique. But this is something that we need to talk about as well. I want to say something about victims of domestic violence as well. I know that we're doing PAIPs here and so forth, but we always have to keep victims in mind. And the late Patty Bland was really good about helping us understand how alcohol and drugs and trauma associated with that can be used as a form of coercion. And she listed a number of things, which I'll just briefly mention a few. Just introducing the partner to drugs or forcing or coercing the partner to use drugs. Isolating them from recovery if they're trying to recover, if they're trying to cut down on their drinking, forcing them or isolating them from anything that could help them. Coercing them into illegal acts like sex work or dealing drugs, sabotaging their recovery efforts, using drug history as a threat, and so forth. These are things that Patty Bland pointed out are other ways, in addition to the actual substance and whatever that the substance does to us that we've talked about. In addition to that, you can actually use the partner's trauma or for example, fear of deportation or fear of getting contacted by the Child Welfare Agency again. All of those kinds of fears can be used to control their behavior in addition to the alcohol itself. So I think that's an important thing that we can talk about. Now I want to stop now and just see whether or not there are any questions.
We do have a comment from
Okay.
Lawrence in the chat. Ironically, in the early stages of the COVID pandemic and stay-at-home lockdown, some states declared liquor stores an essential service, meaning more alcohol was available in homes, and there were cases of people stuck in their homes with a batterer who had more access to alcohol, and reciprocally, there was less opportunity for survivors to escape and or access services.
Right. That packs a whole lot of stuff, doesn't it? That particular comment. And I think that this is something that we're paying close attention to here. I think that the thing I would caution people about, the tendency is to go to immediately to the increase in substance abuse, or not anything to do other than drink, as being the direct cause of the violence. That may be part of it, but I think the commenter also pointed out that not only did COVID increase the tendency to use alcohol because they didn't have much else to do, but it also decreased the ability of potential victims in the face of that alcohol using potential batterer to actually get help or to get away or protect themselves. So that I really appreciate that comment. And my comment to that is there's a bunch of stuff going on there, not just the alcohol. Any other questions or comments? I like questions. I like comments. And I can't see.
Yeah, so sorry. So somebody wrote after that, can we say people who cause harm instead of batterer?
Sure.
And
Yeah,
then
you
we
can
had-
say that, but I'm not going to, if that's okay. But I'd encourage you to.
And then we had a question from Rose. Can you talk about predisposition and possible groups in society affected?
Predispositions. Well, the way predispositions is being used, the way I was using it earlier was predisposition of individuals. Is the question, are there predispositions of social groups of some sort? Is that the gist of the question?
And you can unmute if you have a question.
Yes, unmute.
This is Lori, and Lori Rogers, and I had a question earlier in the chat when you were on that initial study of the users and the rates or percentages of the times they were violent. I just want to make sure I understand. Was this a study of people who used force, or a study of people who used and were subjected to it?
Now remind me which thing I said, because I can't get to that slide.
It was the very first. It was the
IQ
chart.
thing.
It was the chart with, the type of drug that they use.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And just a couple of times you used the word they were experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So I wasn't sure if this included both those who used force and those who did not.
No, thank you for pointing that out. No, this was simply asking a question about whether they'd been the victim of domestic violence. It was not asking whether they used force themselves.
But so that one, the users included both the users of alcohol or drugs or methamphetamine or cocaine or whatever the drug was that was listed. Those users could have been both people using force and people being subjected to that force.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And then someone asked, can you speak more about the cultures with no domestic violence?
I could if I had the book with me. These were 90 small cultures in the world, like it might be a Navajo culture in the Southwest, or a small culture in Greece, not the whole country of Greece, not the whole state of New Mexico, but a small culture within that, a culture that had been a culture for a long time. And they weren't isolated from the rest of the world, but they clearly had cultural values and were somewhat isolated. That's how the 90 cultures were picked by the anthropologists who studied them. And so they would go in and ask questions of the people in that particular group of people. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
And then we have a question, are there more recent studies on DV and substance use?
Yeah, sadly, I no longer have access to the library. So I don't know I've been out of circulation for 3 years now. So yes, there are lots of studies you wouldn't have to spend much time to get those studies either, but if you would have to have access to a library, getting a library online from a university or something like that, which I no longer have. But yes, this is an important area of research, and it goes on all the time.
We have a question, who was author for the book that you mentioned, Family Violence and Cross-Family Perspective? That was bringing up a few different options. Okay.
God, I'm going to block on the name just because you asked me that question. I'll think of it in a second and then I'll tell you. I promise. And if I don't, ask me again. That's terrible. It's terrible to be old.
And then Lawrence, is the book available that addresses cross-cultural studies? Who is the author? I don't know if that's the same book.
It's the same question.
Oh, okay.
And I will look it up and get it to you. I don't know why I don't remember it. It's a study that I've used a lot, but I just don't.
Then we just have some comments. I agree with you, Larry. Saying people cause harm takes off the intensity of abuse toward the victim. This is a way of giving the aggressor a break, and then he becomes less accountable and doesn't work as hard to overcome his abuse.
Well, are you referring to the suggestion that I use more people-oriented phrase rather than batters? I should refer to people who batter or people who use aggression or something like that. Is that what the comment is referring to?
Mona, do you want to speak more on that?
Yes, that was, I'm having a struggle with people who use harm. I'm afraid we're trying to sanitize abusive behavior, and I'm going to stick with you on that one.
Okay. Well, I think it's in general a good idea to say people who use domestic violence as opposed to batterers. Unfortunately, just when you came into the field determines a lot of how you talk, and I just came in at a time before we started using person-centered language like that, and I believe in it. I didn't want to dismiss the person who was making that suggestion, but I just wanted to admit that I'm almost powerless to control myself talking, especially when I'm nervous and talking in front of a crowd. It's hard to sort of regulate myself like this, but I agree with that. I also agree that we don't want to let people off the hook, but we're not going to help anybody if we're calling them names, that's for sure. And so finding a way to humanize people who use domestic violence and recognize that they probably don't want to do that, et cetera, and they have some good characteristics. I think those are important things. But I just have a hard time sort of changing my language when I'm in the middle of a fast gallop.
I don't know how much longer you want to take questions. We do have a question from Steve. I think he wants to say it out loud. So
Okay.
Steve, you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Larry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Larry, I'm from over in Great Britain, work for the British Army. And I'm just, the whole talk really about interpersonal violence or partner violence. I'm thinking to myself that when you're, the talk that you've sort of given is we're looking at people who are using substances in order to, perpetrate that violence, if you like. The term we use over, mainly trying to use over in Britain, is certainly domestic abuse. Because obviously, when you look at violence, of course, that's sort of incident-based abuse as opposed to pattern-based abuse. And so my question really, I suppose, is about the types of things which you're talking about here, whereby somebody is using substances and as possibly an excuse to perpetrate that violence, or it's more prolific, if you like, the more they drink or substances they use. What about that pattern-based abuse, such as, I want my tea on the table at 5 o'clock, or you're not taking the car, or you can't take the children to school, or that type of thing?
I actually think the best word that it would be nice if I could train myself to use is coercion, because
coercion.
I mean, that to me, that you make a great point, that so much of what we're defining as domestic violence or partner abuse or whatever is being are those things that are illegal in wherever we're at. And as you all know, if you're in this field, so very much more of what people who use coercion are involved in is perfectly legal. And we don't want to take that perfectly legal behavior that falls into what I call a category of coercion, but is perfectly legal. We don't want to take that off the table of abuse, but we also recognize that it's just not, that kind of stuff is just not recognized by the court. And it's perfect. 90%, let's admit it, 90% of what people who use coercion do is perfectly legal. And we would like to take all of that off the table, ideally, in an ideal world, not just the stuff that's illegal. So thank you for that comment. I don't know if I addressed the issue at all or not.
Can I just say, Larry, yes, in some ways, yes. It is illegal now in Britain, though, with coercive controlling behaviours. Came in 2015. It is a crime now. Actually carries a higher tariff.
Did you say coercive controlling behaviours?
Yes, coercive controlling behaviour, yes, is
That's actually
now
how they say it?
Yes, yes,
Oh,
coercive
God.
controlling.
We all need to go to Britain.
Yes, so it's a crime. Yes, and like you say, it's probably 99% of domestic abuse. That's what it is. It's the to my mind, or my understanding is that we have somebody will use an act of violence in order to frighten, to I don't know, step up the intensity of the control towards somebody, type of thing. Like the rest of it is controlling coercive behaviours. So thank you anyway, Larry. Thank you very much for your thank you. Yeah,
I mean, if somebody just slams their hand on the table and says, "Shut the fuck up," that's what we're talking about here. That's the kind of thing that is going to be in part linked to substance abuse behavior and all of the other stuff that it could be linked to. And that's the kind of thing that we're mostly in this field to deal with, because getting hit in the face with a closed fist is definitely a very bad thing. But for a lot of us, having being called a name and somebody slamming a fist on the table pretty much has the same effect. And so, and thank you for bringing that up. I should have emphasized that more. We're really taking a broad stroke here in terms of what we call it, domestic violence or intimate partner violence or coercion or whatever we call it. We're really calling it all of that stuff when we're talking about this. And we're really looking at the relationship between substance use and all of that stuff. Any other comments? I appreciate the comments and the questions, and I think we got plenty of time for them.
Yes, Larry, my name is Rose Bernal, and I had a question in the chat about the genetic predisposition. And we live in a state in New Mexico where the majority is Hispanic people, you know, as a minority. And we also have a lot of like a high population of tribal communities. And so that's why I was asking about genetic predisposition to alcohol. And I think because we are a minority state, it kind of gets like overlooked.
The genetic predisposition to alcohol use?
Yes.
Yeah. But yeah, absolutely. That's an important consideration. However, if you're sort of getting the drift of what I'm saying here, even if you have a genetic predisposition, I mean, everybody in your family has been a drunk from long ago. And so you're carrying a big load of genetic predisposition. There's nothing there that would suggest that you ever have to be violent towards anybody else or coercive in your behavior. I guess I'm trying to make an argument that while that genetic predisposition may increase the frequency or the effect of whatever substance you're using or how often you use it, there's still something that's missing between using that substance and being coercive or domestically violent. There's not necessarily a reason that would support that behavior, even if you carry a strong load and you're in a community where 50% of the people have some sort of substance use disorder due to those kind of cultural and predispositions to have that issue. But that still does not suggest that there needs to be any higher rate of domestic violence in that particular community, because that is not what causes the problem.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. I like this question, but I think I want to just move on at this point and talk a little bit about what is to be done. And I will say that, well, when I get to this point, I'll say it. This. If somebody is arrested for domestic violence, or they're seeking help as a victim of domestic violence, or even they're seeking help as a perpetrator of domestic violence on their own without being arrested, which doesn't happen very often, but it could, whose job is it to detect substance abuse? If they come to your shop, whether it's a mental health center, a substance abuse treatment center, a domestic violence program, batters program, victim service agency, whatever, if they come to your shop, whose job is it to detect substance abuse? And what is the policy about that? And how is that going to be done? All of that stuff needs to be written down and followed by everybody who's doing it, or else we're not going to be able to make much of a headway here. So we have to ask that question. Whose job is it to do all of this work? The second thing is, if a man or a woman is arrested for alcohol and drugs, or they're in treatment for alcohol and drugs, whose job is it to detect domestic violence? And what is the policy and in what way? Now you may say, well, we're not here for that. We're not substance abuse folks, we're domestic violence folks. So, no, I bet you a lot of you are substance abuse folks, because to be honest, substance abuse agencies are in a lot of ways doing heavy lifting when it comes to dealing with domestic violence. And a lot of batters programs are in substance abuse agencies. We know this from the national studies that have been done. So a lot of the people who are doing this are substance abuse professionals. And the third issue is, assuming that both domestic violence and substance abuse are both present, how do we sequence or configure interventions? Now, when I was learning about stuff, I was always told that you needed to disclose your standpoint. And so before I go any farther talking about intervention, I want you to be clear about what I think, what my assumptions are about what we're doing. I think that the purpose of intervention is to increase the safety of victims, to hold offenders accountable, and to enhance recovery and abuse-free living for all. I think that's why we're doing what we're doing. I think substance abuse, either by the victim or by the offender, makes the victim less safe. Now, notice I'm not saying that the victim is causing the violence. I'm just saying that it's not always a her, and it's not always a heterosexual relationship. So I'm apologize for my pronoun problem here. But again, my nervousness just makes me blather out all kinds of stuff. So the victim is less safe. I think that both battering and victimization threaten substance abuse recovery. I think that abuse, domestic violence, coercion is a vehicle that controls the other person. And bottom line is, the sooner we understand this as denial of civil rights and not just a criminal behavior, the better off we're going to be. I think that in our society, and I'm using a broad our society here, I apologize for that, but our culture, I think our society really reinforces substance abuse. You don't have to pay too much attention to television or movies to figure out that everybody's drinking. We see partner violence and intoxicated partner violence all the time in the media. And because of this, because this is so permeated in our society, neither substance use disorder nor domestic violence can ever really be viewed entirely at the personal level. There is a view in our field that this is a social issue and not just individual problems, but unfortunately we don't act as if that's the case for the most part. We still utilize the criminal justice system and the healthcare system, and we use the sort of individualistic perspectives that they hold, except at times of COVID, of course, but then everything becomes us. But for the most part, we view things as individual issues. I think that's wrong. And most importantly, abstinence and sobriety are neither necessary nor sufficient for nonviolence. You can get somebody clean and sober all you want. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be violent. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you know this, but I'll just say it again. The most dangerous time and when somebody is in treatment for substance abuse is when they're newly abstinent. Not newly sober, because that involves something else, but newly abstinent. Not using the drug that they've been married to for a long time is a dangerous, dangerous time. And so if somebody is just getting clean and stopping drinking, don't think that that's going to do anything other than increase the risk for domestic violence, because that's exactly what's going to happen. So if we assume that we have domestic violence and substance use disorder both present, then how do we configure interventions? There's really 4 ways of doing it. We could do it one after the other, what we call serial intervention. And usually that's the substance abuse treatment first, then the batterers program. I don't believe in that necessarily, but that's kind of how things are done. And of course, the court has a lot to say about this. So some of this is out of your control. A parallel intervention, we got 2 things going on at once with little contact. The guys in substance abuse treatment here are getting treatment for his depression there. I'm not mentioning co-occurring disorders other than substance use issues, but we could just as easily have this workshop on depression and anxiety. It'd be pretty much the same thing. But we could have them getting treatment for their various problems in different places, but if those places don't coordinate that treatment or have any contact, we call that parallel intervention. Integrated intervention, the same agency provides both services, one-stop shopping. And finally, and this goes in the order in which I think we should do them, coordinated intervention. These are different but closely linked agencies providing substance abuse and domestic violence treatment intervention. and I'll talk about each of these. But first, let me talk about, should we expect all of you to screen and refer for substance use disorders? That is, all of you who are in partner abuse intervention programs and victim service agencies as well, for that matter. Yes, we do. We expect you to do that. You should screen everybody. And not only once, you should screen throughout the time that they're in your program. Big mistake, which we found about a big Gondel CDC study, was that a lot of times the domestic violence started again once they were in the program, and that people would be screened as having a substance use issue, but unless it was dealt with, they would continue to use throughout the program. Now, some of you say, well, we don't allow that here. We do drug tests and all that. If I have time, I'll talk about that. I'm not a big fan of that sort of stuff, but you have to live in the community that you're in, and whatever it says is what you have to do. Should we expect all programs to screen and refer for IPV victimization? Absolutely. We know that the rate of domestic violence in gay and lesbian, and we think in transsexual, but we don't know that for sure. But certainly in gay and lesbian relationships is the same as the rate in straight relationships. That we're pretty sure of. We're not 100% sure because we can't take a random sample, but we're pretty sure of it. All the studies have indicated that. Should we expect all programs to screen and refer for IPV? No, we do not want anybody to do that. Why? Because it's a tremendous risk to the victim. If you ask somebody coming into your program, and it's not a batterers program, we've obviously identified, but let's say it's a substance abuse program, you ask a person, we want you to ask about their being the victim of domestic violence in all substance abuse programs. And we want you to ask about that as well in the batterers program. You got to ask that question, and so forth. But we have to be very careful if we're asking a person about whether or not they've ever committed domestic violence, because let's admit it, if the person is not in a batterers program, but they're in a substance abuse program, if you ask them that question, they're going to know why you're asking that question. And they're going to take care of that business as soon as they can. So it's dangerous to do that. I'll say more about this in a second. So assuming that all the services and sanctions are not provided by the same entity, that's usually the case. That's usually the case. A person, a substance abuse agency, for example, certainly would provide substance abuse to both men and women treatment. And they may also provide a batterers program, or they may also provide a victim service agency. But in most cases, all of this stuff is provided by different entities. So the real problem becomes, how do we work together? How do multiple entities work together to support victim safety and perpetrator accountability and SUD recovery? That's really the issue. So as I said earlier, people normally go, I used to have two arrows here. I had an arrow going both from domestic violence program to the substance abuse, as well as to the substance abuse and DV. I just took out the second arrow after so many years of using a slider. It really only goes one way. Nobody refers to the domestic violence program first and then to substance abuse treatment. So it always goes one way. That's a serial intervention. Now, the problem with serial interventions, and there are many, is that the offender, the PERP, rarely shows up at the second service, which is most cases the partner abuse intervention program. Why? Because they get acculturated in the primary problem, which is addiction. And they learn the language of addiction and recovery. And all of a sudden, and of course, they may have people at that agency who understand domestic violence very well, and they don't want to give the idea that addiction is the only cause of domestic violence. But it's going to come across, and they're going to learn that in the group, in the 12-step programs that they attend, and so forth. They're going to get acculturated in addiction, and they're not going to go and into a new culture. This can work if we had a high level of case management, we had highly trained staff, very assertive and on top of business, probation officers. We could maybe pull that off, but I'll talk about best practices in a minute, but the current best practice that pretty much everybody agrees on is there should be no serial intervention except detox. In other words, that we shouldn't send people, you have to send people a detox first if they need a medical detox. They just got to do that. And then they can go to other programs or whatever, but they should not just go to the, after they get out of detox, it should just not go to the to the addiction program until they complete their third step or until whatever the criteria is before they would get referred out to for mental health issues or for domestic violence issues. As I said, most likely they're not going to get referred out. So best practice at this point, no serial interventions. Integrated interventions or one-stop shopping, that's what the United Way and funding sources would all like to see. People who are economically oriented, it makes sense. This agency, the substance abuse and domestic violence, can be integrated in a number of different ways. Usually, most likely is either a mental health agency that happens to have both substance abuse treatment program and perhaps victim service and perhaps batters program as well, as a side program to their regular mental health programs. In that sense, it could be integrated, but it really isn't going to be integrated because at a mental health agency, you're going to have your substance abuse staff. You're going to have your people work with children. You're going to have your emergency psychiatry bunch. You're going to have your domestic violence bunch, et cetera. Those programs are really not going to be integrated, even though they're in the same shop. If there's a substance abuse agency, like the second one, the agency and staff are integrated, substance abuse agencies do a lot of in-house work with batterers. In our Beth Reed's in our study that we did nationally, thanks to David Garvin and other people, we found that a lot of the substance abuse agencies that we contacted, because we were looking at substance abuse and domestic violence together in a couple hundred different agencies nationally. And a lot of substance abuse agencies have in-house batterers programs. And then the third possibility, which I never see, but I have to put it there just for the sake of argument, is there might be possibly a theoretically integrated program. That is a program built on a theoretical foundation like Power Model or like trauma theory or something else, where they're dealing with a particular theoretical perspective on both substance abuse and domestic violence. Like I say, that's there just because I think it should be there. It's a placeholder. The problem with integrated services is the accountability and standards. If I'm a substance abuse agency, there's a good chance that I'm going to be accountable to substance abuse licensing bodies and standards and so forth. That's where my accountability lies. Now, some states who do batterers programs have certain criteria for connection with victim service agencies and so forth, but that isn't across the board by any means. Damn cat. I love my cat. He's pestering me. The problem is also in these integrated services is they get oftentimes reduced to the common denominator, which is usually a substance abuse. And the real problem with these is finding and paying properly trained staff. And that's not easy. So for all of those reasons, integrated services are not that likely. Coordination is a far more likely, and in my opinion, a far more effective way to go about this. We have substance abuse treatment programs, we have domestic violence agencies, and they are in contact with one another at all times on all cases that they share. Now, you know, the problem with this, of course, is confidentiality, HIPAA, all kinds of things. Both domestic violence agencies and substance abuse agencies are accountable to higher powers, and they're often different higher powers. And so for that reason, going back and forth with information is something that has to be done formally through a series of memoranda of understanding and so forth. These programs are also more expensive to do compared to integrated programs. I think they're better. I'm just saying that because we don't actually know, but I think that's probably going to be the case once we know. The time commitment for intensive treatments, as we all know, a person arrested for domestic violence and also found to have a substance abuse issue is in a world of hurt in terms of going to all the meetings and programs and paying all the money that they have to pay to all these different people. And so having an extra agency in there, or maybe a couple extra agencies if they also have a anxiety disorder or something like that. It could be a lot of different agencies. Anyway, the time commitment and the money commitment to intensive treatments like this that are coordinated might be too much. And finally, cognitive impairment in early recovery. While I'm saying that would be the only reason that there needs to be some kind of non-serial intervention, that is a pretty big reason. And there are a lot of people who do need medical assistance early on, and that has to be provided by medical people and who understand addiction as well. There have been a variety of attempts to look at this issue. I'm not going to go through these. These are very, very different kinds of programs. Duluth model was used in Dade County to look at integrated substance abuse and domestic violence, and it was successful. They used CBT at Yale. This is only a 10-session thing, so they don't even meet the criteria, I don't think, in their own state for a batterers program. But we are getting good information. We're getting good information from everything here. The clinical trial, motivational enhancement, clinical trial Chris Murphy did at the University of Maryland, looked at this issue as well through a motivational enhancement perspective. A more community-based approach is the ADA Dawn Farm thing, which I'm not sure what the status of that is. David could probably answer that better. But at the time that I was first exposed to that 15 years or so ago, I was very impressed. This was a community level coordination thing going on in which there was a lot of back and forth, kind of the way agencies ought to do back and forth. I was very impressed. And then there's the Harvard Behavioral Couples Therapy Program, which is really kind of it's something that we have to deal with. Why do we have to deal with it? Because it's been shown to be effective. And they don't discuss domestic violence at all. And they were able to reduce the domestic violence in the population that they're treating without talking about it at all, simply by dealing with using couples therapy. Now, I have been fairly vocal in my criticism of this because the people who are in this study in no way resemble the people coming to your program, not even a little bit. But we can't ignore it. We can't ignore the fact that just improving the relationship in people who feel safe doing that, which is another thing that we have to deal with this thing about, and in reducing the substance abuse and having both people look at substance abuse behavior together as a couple has been found to be effective. And I'll just leave it at that. We can't act like this doesn't fit with our personal model when the data suggests that it's effective. So we have to address it. So there are some resources out there that I want to expose you to. Now, one of the things I want to expose you to, this is actually something that I found in Illinois, in Springfield, Illinois, as a matter of fact, according to that. This was laying on a table after we did a workshop. This was when we were implementing I'll show you the thing we implemented in a minute. The manual for co-occurring substance abuse and domestic violence. And we were doing a series of workshops to roll this out in the state, and somebody left this on the table. I know who left it, and I talked because I saw him doing it. And he happened to be the director of a mental health center, of a program in a mental health center that happened to have a domestic violence and a substance abuse program as a part of it. And I think you can see what's going on here. We have a little tiny domestic violence fish that is being eaten alive by a much bigger addictions and substance abuse fish, which is being eaten alive by a much bigger mental health fish, all of whom are being swallowed in their entirety by the criminal justice system. This pretty much, in my mind, I'd be interested in what your mind says about this, but this, in my mind, lays out a big problem that we have in this field. And the criminal justice system is without a doubt one of the biggest problems that we have in this field. I know that you guys talk about this all the time, so I won't necessarily talk about it, but this is something, this is a kind of a framework for what I'm saying now. The first thing that we tried, that they tried to do to look at substance abuse and domestic violence was the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's TIP 25 in 1997. This was brought together some substance abuse people and some domestic violence people and some researchers and some writers who took down information, and they turned it into a manual for how to deal with co-occurring substance abuse and domestic violence. And it was, since it's SAMHSA, this was very much on the substance abuse side of the equation. In other words, after these people did their thing and came up with the manual, it was sent out for review, and it was sent out to review to directors of substance abuse treatment programs. And I can tell you, having been there, that what went out as defining men who batter as men who were engaging in criminal behavior, it came back as men who had co-occurring depression. So they messed with it a little bit. And that was enough to get some of us, at least in Illinois, to write our own damn manual, I guess I'd say. And that's what we did. But this SAMHSA manual, TIP 25, is important in the sense that there are some key points that it makes, and I want to make those to you now. That this relationship between substance abuse and domestic violence varies by individuals. So everybody has to be screened and treated individually. We can't have these sort of one-size-fits-all approaches. I know this is a big issue in the response field, and it needs to be a bigger issue. And substance abuse field has been a little bit better about matching intervention to the characteristics of the consumers, but we need to be doing more of this in the domestic violence field, and certainly if we ever come together as a coordinated field, we would need to do even more of it then. There were a lot of people there who believed in self-help, and they believed in self-help for batterers. There is such a thing as Batterers Anonymous. The only one I actually know about for sure was in Milwaukee. But I'm assured by people who know that this actually goes on. And I remember having the daylight scared out of me, just thinking about what it must be like sitting around in a circle of 10 or 12 men who are arrested for domestic violence, who are mutually self-helping one another. That just is uncomfortable. And so there was a fight about this, and there was no agreement on the value of self-help for batterers. I remain opposed to that, but I could be convinced. And they pointed out, as I've pointed out to you earlier, that the most dangerous period for domestic violence is early abstinence. So serial intervention is not recommended. That's one of the things that this TIP 25 really said, was no serial intervention, no going to substance abuse treatment first, getting to your third step, and then going to making the referral to the batterers program. And that upset a lot of people in the substance abuse side. And I get that, but that was the recommendation. Out of our frustration, with tip 25, we decided to convene, or by we, I mean the Illinois Department of Human Services, decided to convene a group, and we came up with a manual that was eventually called Safety and Sobriety, Best Practices in Domestic Violence and Substance Abuse. And by the way, both of these are available online. You can download these. This is the second edition, and I would recommend that you not pay attention to the first edition. The thing about safety and sobriety that's different is it's written by program type. There's a chapter for people working in child welfare agency. There's a chapter for people of color. There's a chapter for gay and lesbian folks who work with domestic violence in that particular community, and so forth and so on. It's divided up by sort of service area, and I like it for that reason. And you're welcome to download that as well. The important points from that particular manual from Safety and Sobriety was, first of all, that these things are intertwined. If you pull on one, you're going to pull on the other one. And we recommended that we have to screen people throughout the program. You have to screen them for domestic violence throughout the program, which I'm sure you do. But I'm not as sure that you screen them for things like alcohol and depression and anxiety throughout the program. So I'm going to recommend that you do that. And incidentally, the CDC study also made the recommendation that you screen throughout the program. That there needs to be ongoing linkage agreements between domestic violence and substance abuse agencies, victim service agencies, and batterers programs, and substance abuse organizations. Ongoing linkage agreements, and these things need to be updated on a regular basis. And keep in mind that staff change all over the place. So you can't rely on staff training to do this, because you're going to be training staff all the time. You're going to have policies. Things need to be written down. People need to read these things and initial the fact that they've read them and that they're going to do them. So we need to have ongoing linkage agreements. And we also recommended, and we don't have total control over this, this is a court issue a lot of times, and prosecutors are not fond of this issue, that completion of a batterers program depends on completing recommendations for substance abuse treatment. That if they refuse to go to substance abuse treatment and it's assessed in the batterers program that they need to do that, or they don't complete the batterers program. So anyway, that's a few of the things from safety and sobriety. Now, I have a little time left, and I want to leave time for questions at the end. So I'm going to give you two sort of models here these are written models that have been done. One is called the Addiction Recovery and Intimates Violence Model. This was funded by SAMHSA. And this is a model for people in substance abuse treatment. This is looking for domestic violence in addiction settings. And you don't need to worry about reading that, but that's just what the model looks like. I'll give you each section. And I'll say something about this guys, my favorite guys. Back when I said that don't be asking people about perpetrating domestic violence if you're in addictions programs or mental health, or anything other than a batterers program, because it's dangerous to the victim. We did some videos to illustrate this thing. SAMHSA paid us to do these videos, and we had to hire professional actors. We had to drive to goddamn Ohio to do it. Apparently, they don't have actors anywhere else. But I like this guy, this actor. And we were trying to figure out what to do about asking questions in addictions programs about domestic violence without being scared and dangerous to victims. And we sort of took a page out of victim service agencies who typically put things in women's bathrooms with cards on them that they can take, and how they can get in touch with people. We figure if you're going to be in an addiction agency and you're going to ask flat out about domestic violence, you need to make it clear somehow that we ask this question about everybody who walks the door. You're not special in this regard. Subtext, your partner didn't have anything to do with this. And the actor said, why don't you just put a sign up? All right, that made a lot of sense. And so we stuck a sign there, and we recommended to all of the substance abuse treatment programs that when they do domestic violence work, that they always make it clear that they have signs throughout the facility that we're always going to be talking about domestic and sexual violence in this shop. That's how it's going to go down here. And that way, now that doesn't protect potential victims entirely, but it takes a step in the right direction. So we suggested that these agencies all use a 3-item screen. This is a validated 3-item screen. I'll show it to you in the next slide. And then if, depending on what any positive response to this 3-item screen means you need to make a decision about whether the client was in danger. If there was no response at all to any of those questions, there are all no answers, then we thought you needed to give them an educational pamphlet on domestic violence that included names and addresses and phone numbers of local domestic violence agencies and how to get in touch with them, and local mental health agencies as well, how to get in touch with them, that you ought to hand that out to them. And that you ought to continue with whatever you were doing and not drop the idea, because you're going to, your normal process at this agency ought to be reviewing this periodically, but at least there's no need for doing something immediate at that point. If you do get a positive response to one of these questions, then you need to do something else. And I like these questions, and the reason we picked this was done, this was published in JAMA probably 10 years ago. I like this because it asked the punch question, you know, like the CTS always asks about how often you're beaten up, sort of totally ignoring a lot of other stuff that our friend from Great Britain had talked about earlier. But they're asking the hurt or threatened, kicked, punched, all of those kind of punch questions that we ask. Go ahead and ask one of those, whether that's happened in the last year. Then ask a couple of questions that are not about punching. Do you feel safe in your current relationship? And is there a partner from a previous relationship who is making you feel unsafe now? And that particular question is really important because, as you so well know, lots of people get divorces or discontinue their relationship and share children. And this is, as someone who did custody evaluation for many, many years for the courts, I can tell you that this is a big deal. Sharing children is the grounds for domestic violence in a lot of situations. So I like these questions. So if you got a positive response to any of those questions, then you went on and did a brief intervention. Now, this is an FBIRT model. Those of you who are screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment model. That's an evidence-based public health model. Those of you in the addictions field are well aware of SBIRT. This is the brief intervention part of SBIRT. The first action that you do, the first brief intervention, is you give them the same intervention pamphlet that you would have given them, educational pamphlet that you would have given them earlier had you not screened them positive. Then you develop a safety plan with them. Now, we gave examples of safety plans. As those of you who work with in victim service agency knows, this is a pretty big deal and can be pretty complicated and time consuming, but you can slim it down if for a basic safety plan in this kind of situation. And then finally, the third brief intervention that you do, and this all needs to occur fairly quickly, is you do two trauma assessments, one using the ACE, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and another using the, I'll show you what it is. This is the ACE, which I'm sure that Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, I'm sure that all of you have been exposed to this. And a lot of victim service agencies have moved into trauma informed care. And this is very much a part of that kind of thing, looking at the sort of life that brought people into the situation that they're in now, and trying to get an idea of what kind of trauma level you're dealing with this person. And then the first, worst, last, typical. This is the first way I learned to screen for domestic violence way long time ago. You ask the person about what was the first time the partner was abusive to you, and they talk about that. What was the worst episode of abuse you ever experienced? And they talk about that. What was the last episode of abuse that they experienced? And they talk about that. And then of all of the experiences that you had, what was the most typical form of abuse? And you talk about that. Now keep in mind, these are people in substance abuse treatment. I think those of you in domestic violence would do this differently. But just getting something down on paper about their domestic violence experience without having given some stupid, domestic violence form like the CTS. This actually lets them talk about it. And I think it's the talking about it that makes a difference. So that's why we like that. And then finally, referral. We developed what's called a robust referral guide. That differs from what some people call a referral because it's robust, meaning there's a lot more to it. The first question you have to ask is whether or not there are services available for the co-occurring issue. There's a lot of you who live in places where there might be one domestic violence agency for every 10 or 20 counties. I mean, that's not unusual in this country. And so there may not be services available. And if there are not, then we need to take that upon ourselves with ongoing check-ins and supervisory consultation. And if there are, refer them to the program and then find out whether or not the referral is successful. Now, a robust referral, I'm kind of militant about this. This is something that is optimally supportive, in which a formal relationship exists in advance between the agency that you're referring to and that you're referring and the target agency that you're referring to. This relationship exists in advance and it's on paper, and there are memoranda of understanding. You don't just tell somebody, you don't just give somebody the number of a substance abuse treatment program and tell them to call and make an appointment. That's the exact wrong thing to do. Then you actively engage the client in the referral process. You don't just say, this is what you do. You say, how much, use motivational enhancement to do this. How much do you think you'll be able to do this? What's the chances you'll actually pull this off, et cetera. And the target agency is contacted by the referring person prior to the referral being made, so they know that the referral is going to come. And the cost and everything to the client are known by the client in advance. And this next one I get a lot of flack on, but I insist that you got to get them there. It's your responsibility to get them there. You need to do something if they need transportation. Either give them transportation, put them in your car and drive them there, give them bus fare, do something. Don't just expect people to show up. That's the difference between a referral and a robust referral. You also follow up with the person you're referring to confirm that they showed, to understand what was found and so forth, and to get documentation of the results. So anyway, that's a robust referral. Now I'm going, and incidentally, both of these things, this is going to be a SUD curriculum for batters programs. All of these things are available. They're going to be available to you if you email me, rather than put all of that on the New Mexico to do all that work. My email address is, you'll have it when you get my slides, and you will get my slides. My email address is on the cover page of these slides. If you email and say, I would like that SUD curriculum for partner abuse intervention programs, the little document that goes with that, which I get profusely thank David Adams and Bob Hayner and Carol Gerard and Ed Watson in Massachusetts for developing an outstanding program called SHADE, which is a safety and health through alcohol and drug education program. It's a public health program for both domestic violence and substance use. And they did a lot of heavy lifting that I stole from them with their permission. But this is like the other curriculum that we had earlier for the domestic violence or for the substance abuse agencies. This one has not been empirically evaluated. So as this stands right now, this is pipe dream. I have some goals and objectives for this program. And incidentally, I wrote this at the continual haranguing of Oliver Williams. I would never have done this had he not so brutally insisted that I had to. There are goals and objectives. These don't meet the criteria of actual measurable objectives, but they give you a path to a measurable objective of health education, knowledge, screening, motivation, and myth busting. There are the table of contents. It'll be a Word file that will come to you if you want it. It's probably maybe 30, 40 pages long, including all of the appendices, which contain a lot of tools, which I think are helpful. And incidentally, even though we're talking about substance abuse and domestic violence, I'm a big believer in the K6 as a 6-item measure developed by the World Health Organization to be culturally appropriate across cultures. It's a wonderful tool for assessing general malaise, general dissatisfaction, general frustration with your life, the kind of things that would lead you to not get better from substance abuse or decrease your domestic violence. So the K6 is in there. I recommend that you read it. It takes about 2 minutes to do at most. And it's a good mental health measure, probably. The PHQ-9 is also, it's a 9-item measure. It's also a good mental health measure. Either the PHQ-9 or the K6 are the best, in my opinion, mental health measures that can be done within a minute or two. Anyway, that's the table of contents. There's 4 lessons plans. These were meant to be scalable. That is, you could work this into a 16-week program if there are such things anymore. Or a 26-week program or a 52-week program. These can be scaled out. They're basically 90-minute things. The first one is alcohol and other drugs 101. You'd be surprised. You would be very surprised if you talk to people who use alcohol and drugs, how little they actually know about alcohol and drugs. But anyway, I'll show you that in a second. Self-screening, which is probably the only one of these lesson plans that I would say you really got to do. You got to have people screen themselves and then use those self-screenings in group, in my opinion. Learning bystander intervention is an evidence-based practice developed in the sexual assault field, I believe, primarily, originally, but now expanded. What is it to stand by and see stuff going on and do something about it? What are your responsibilities? What should you do? And then finally, moving towards community resources. And all of these are independent. So anyway, I'm going to not spend much time on these, but I've given you a little piece of information for each of these 4. I show you little pictures there. These pictures, the whole issue about what is a drink, how many drinks in a 40 of Colt 45 or a 5th of Hennessy. These are kinds of questions that people just don't usually know. One of the ways I think you get to be a card-carrying substance abuser is to think filling up a big cup full of wine is 5 ounces of wine. It's usually probably about 12 ounces of wine. So that's helpful to people. And it's helpful to people to talk about it in a group. And as you know, in a group, you're going to have people with all kinds of different levels of experience, including people who don't use alcohol and drugs at all. Self-screening, that's an important thing to do in the group. There's a bunch of scales in there for them to self-screen themselves on, including their willingness to change. And there are a variety of change users, how much I need to change, how much I can change if I set my mind to it, different sort of change rulers. It's really good to get people thinking about this stuff. And all of these things, if you were to collect them anonymously, so you don't know necessarily the people, or if you wanted to put pins on them and use them so that they wouldn't be identifiable to anybody else other than you and the person, you could do that as well. There's a place for personal identification numbers on them. Anyway, talk about the importance of understanding the difference between screening and assessment. Screening only has two answers, yes or no. If you screen somebody and they screen in as a yes, that means they need an assessment. If they screen as a no, that means they don't need an assessment. A screen can be done by anybody. They don't have to be professional, not by a long shot. And anybody can do them. In fact, I've often felt bartenders and hairstylists probably taught to screen, and I know that this has actually been done in some places. These are great screeners, but an assessment has to be done by somebody who understands, because an assessment is basically finding out how long they've had the issue, what the dynamics of it was, and coming up with some kind of an idea about what might do it. And incidentally, computer and written screens are far more reliable than face-to-face screens. If just asking people questions and having them look at you and give you an answer automatically inhibits people. So if you can do it on a computer, that's probably the best way to do it. And we got a huge amount of data in the public health field to support that idea around health issues, and written screens if you don't have computers. But these are better than face-to-face screens. And here's a little thing on bystander intervention. And we propose the idea of using your sister. What would you do if your sister had a substance abuse issue? What would you do if your sister were being battered? The reason we do this is because we think that it will allow the person to be a lot more empathic toward the person that they're talking about than they might ordinarily be. And they could be a make-believe sister or a woman that they know that they not have any relationship with. So a series of questions like that. And the whole idea is to have the group discuss being a bystander to something that you might need to do something about, and how do you go about that? And you know, I won't say anything more about it. I'll just send you the document. And then move towards community resources. And that's it. So I think at this point, what I want to do is, I've got a few minutes left, and I want to use every single one of those few minutes. And I will stay after class as needed for you to ask questions or make comments. And I welcome your comments.
Larry, you're incredible. This is great. We asked you for a snack and you gave everybody a meal. There is a handful of questions. One person asked if you could put the FWLT slide up again. So as we're taking other questions, John, the PAIP is a partner abuse intervention program. As you go around the country, there are so many different titles for what we typically hear called battering intervention programs or offender intervention programs, partner abuse intervention programs. So depending on where you are, that's the term, and that's the PAIP that's an Illinois term, Larry?
It is, and I like it.
Okay.
Just call them dips.
So Kelly is asking about getting the documents. Are we sending those out, Terry?
No. If you want, you're sending the slides out, and on the slides, on the first slide is my email address. If you want any of this last stuff, those two for the substance abuse programs and for the batters programs, to sort of use in your program as you see fit, these are not proprietary, or nobody owns these things, then I will send that to you attached to an email. It'll come as a Word document.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Other questions? If you'd like to unmute, or if you want to raise your hand, your little Zoom hand, we can get your questions going here. We've got a handful of, so Kinneret, go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for your talk. So I am a co-facilitator of PAIP or BIP groups. And one of the things that we hear a lot from clients is, you know, I committed that act of violence, the precipitating event that brought us to group. It was while I was using, it was while I was high, it was while I was drunk. Now everything is great. Everything is so great in my partnership. And because we use like a Duluth model, we really try to lead with curious questions rather than education. And I was wondering, what would be the next question? So somebody has just taken accountability, but they've qualified their accountability. They've said, I did do this. I threw her down. I strangled her. But I did it while I was drunk. And I'm so glad now I'm in AA. Now I've turned to God, and now I'm not using or drinking, and this never will happen again.
Right. I don't know. I'd be curious about what other people would say about, first of all, it's been 30 years since I've done a batterers program. So I am probably the last person in the world to talk to about the details of batterers programs. But my first response is, first of all, to praise the person for having recovered, for having gotten into recovery, and focus on that, and not focus on the question that they want the answer to, which is now, why do I need to be in this program if I no longer have the problem that got me here? And the second thing would be to have a discussion in the group. First of all, ask them how they went about recovering, and there might be other people in the group that could do that, but ask other people in the group whether or not they had also had that experience. I'm an old group worker, and I like turning things that are posed as a personal challenge or as a personal question into a group discussion. So any opportunity you can get to do that is what I would do. And I'm pretty sure that Duluth would go along with that as a way to go about this. What do you think the issue would be that you would do? What have you done?
One of the things, no, I appreciate praising. I think every time there is something offered where there has been any growth, I think there is so much importance and goodwill in just saying, like, that took a lot to get there, instead of just continuing to hold some kind of future off. I think where I have tended to go is to say, how, like, thank you for sharing that. How do you still notice that power and control might still be going on in your relationship now, even though you are no longer using? So to kind of look and see if there's anything present now that, even if it's not violent, that might fit on the power control wheel, so that we can lower the standard, just address coercive behavior rather than just violent behavior. Yeah. I think sometimes what I've heard a co-facilitator say is, like, they say that, like, alcohol is like the garage remote control, and that the stuff is in the garage anyway. The alcohol just lifted the door. So what we're doing here in group is we're like, the fact that you drank and that contributed to it. There are happy drunks, there are non-violent drunks. There's some reason why you used violence when you were drinking. And you're revealing, it almost revealed something that was already there, but maybe you didn't see it. So that's what we're doing here. We're trying to, now that the remote has lifted the garage door, how can we look at what's inside, the beliefs, the intentions, and how can we look at what might be there?
Yeah, I like the garage door analog. That's really good. Catch people being good any chance you can, because the whole flies and vinegar kind of story. Anytime you can catch somebody doing something right, you need to make a big deal out of it. And I think that's where you were headed with praising the person for their adhering to their program. And I would also say that there's a tremendous opportunity to adhere to the program here that they're in as well, in addition to the program that they're in. And who knows how good the relationship could become if they adhere to the work that they are doing here, the same way they adhere to the 12-step program that they're going to. So use any opportunity you can to catch somebody doing the right thing and praise them for it. That's always the right thing to do with kids and batterers.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's given me something to mull on.
Okay.
Kinneret, the other thing I would say is if you can send me an email, and hopefully you've got my email, I can send you, we don't have it turned on this account where I can drop it into the chat, an article on operationalizing accountability, which looks at kind of a progressive understanding in a way that makes sense to participants about what we mean by accountability. So when you talked about the conditional accountability, I think this will be useful for you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I will follow up. Thank you
Okay.
so much. I will follow up.
You're welcome. Other questions while we still have Larry here?
And as we wait for those questions to come in the chat, possibly, I wanted to make a quick announcement before people log off. You will be receiving an email from me, from the coalition, with a survey to obtain your certificate of attendance. There are no CEUs offered for this session. I know that I had a couple of questions if we were providing that. So it will just be a certificate for your participation or attendance. Please let us know how this training was for you and if you would like us to offer any other trainings. As Larry did mention, I can share the PowerPoint, but for any other documents, I will also provide his email address so you can reach out to him. This session is recorded. So for those of you that might have logged on a little bit after our morning introductions, this session is recorded. We will have it on our YouTube channel. Please follow us on our YouTube for NMCA-DV. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram as well as Twitter. If you have any questions or other concerns, please feel free to reach out to me as well directly. David, I'll give it back to you if there are any more questions.
Okay. There was a question here from Jill about essentially about blackouts. Larry, if you want to, do you want to say anything about blackouts and what they actually are versus what the person who went through them would hope they would be?
I don't really feel qualified to address the physiology of blackouts. I know that they don't occur. Blackouts don't occur among all or even most alcoholics. But if a person has a blackout, the chance that they have a substance use disorder is very high. What they actually are, I do not know.
So I'm going to put my 2 cents in on that one. That if you're old enough to remember the VHS tapes, if you took a magnet and put it on a VHS tape, you erase part of the movie that was on that tape, and it's just gone. It is not replaced. If you were watching Star Wars, it's not replaced with Gone with the Wind. So in other words, when somebody's having a blackout, they are not doing something that they wouldn't normally do, that they haven't given themselves permission to do when they were sober, that this is an okay thing for me to do while I'm drunk. It's, somebody who is in a blackout doesn't suddenly learn martial arts or how to speak a different language or how to behave differently. They are just not able to remember what happened. So I think having that clear baseline understanding and helping the participants understand that as well is critical.
Good point.
Larry, as always, hitting the ball out of the park. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of the coalition, on behalf of all those, our funders who support our trainings. Thank you everyone for joining in on this. Please be on the lookout for the email from Terry. That is how you will get your certificate. If you don't do the evaluation, you won't get a certificate. It's directly tied in. As soon as you fill that out, within probably 10 to 15 minutes, you will get a certificate with your name on it. So make sure you make sure you spell your name right and everything like that, because it's going to automate that from your evaluation. Thank you, everybody.
So long. Thank you.